quick snow.
I will first off.
Who's pulling off another panel?
Hello. Wow. Okay. How's everybody doing?
Trevor might be today. Just kidding. She doesn't roll her sleeves.
Good? Yeah. Okay, good.
I will be.
Great. I'm doing well too, thanks for asking. So we, there's some weirdness with the parking garage at Euclid, so we're a little late in getting started, just kind of giving people the opportunity to filter in. My name is Thomas Andrews. I'm a professor of history here and director of the Center of the American West. And I'm going to do a little introduction, maybe more like a mid-sized introduction. And that'll kind of give people time to filter in, just as it sort of serves to get all of us on the same page for this afternoon's talk. So thank you all for being here. We really appreciate it. This event kicks off a new and exciting initiative, a year of Center of the American West programming devoting to helping CU Boulder students and the university community more broadly explore and provide new insights relating to the incarceration of 125,000 Japanese and Japanese Americans by the federal government during World War II. The Seo HEREBY Family Student Research Fellowship and Symposium is made possible by the generosity of Eddie Seo. Mr. Seo grew up in Los Angeles, then was rounded up and imprisoned for most of the war at the Hart Mountain, Wyoming camp, which was operated by the War Relocation Authority. Several years ago, Mr. Seo made a gift to the Center of the American West to encourage student research on Japanese American wartime incarceration. When Mr. Seo conveyed these funds to us, it's my understanding that he expressed a desire to honor Lane Hirabayashi, a leading scholar on this subject, and a one-time faculty member in CU Boulder's Department of Ethnic Studies. As Mr. Seo knew, Professor Hirabayashi hailed from a prominent Japanese American family. Most famously, his uncle, Gordon Hirabayashi, challenged his incarceration right up to the highest court in the land. Gordon Hirabayashi served as the plaintiff in an unsuccessful 1943 case, U.S. versus Hirabayashi, one of several legal challenges that Japanese Americans mounted to challenge the constitutionality of Executive Order 9066, as well as its implementation. Gordon Hirabayashi then went on to a long and distinguished career as a sociologist. In 1987, a U.S. court finally vacated his 1943 convictions. The Seo Hirabayashi Family's Fellowship and Symposium seeks to honor Eddie Seo, Lane Hirabayashi, and their families by shedding new light on a dark chapter in American history that, I am sad to say, seems especially relevant in our current political context. In addition to thanking the Seo and Hirabayashi families for their profound contributions, I also want to thank a trio of faculty members for their guidance in designing this year's programming. Jennifer Ho of Ethnic Studies and Director of the Center for Humanities and the Arts, Marcia Yamamoto of History, and Dean Daryl Maeda, Professor of Ethnic Studies and Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences, have all been extraordinarily generous in advising CAW. I also want to give a special thank you to Julia Shizuyo Popham, a PhD student in Ethnic Studies, for developing the idea for a fellowship that would support students in producing original research and creative work through ongoing faculty mentoring. Thank you so much, Julia. When we circulated announcements for the fellowship, we had no idea how many applications we would receive. And we couldn't be more thrilled at the enthusiastic response from undergraduates and graduate students alike. And indeed, sadly, we had more applications than we could possibly fund. But once we saw the flood of applications and when we saw how strong and thought-provoking they were, we basically went around trying to get additional money and have been quite successful in that. So we've been able to expand this program beyond what we originally intended, and we're able to do that through the generosity of, again, Jennifer Ho, as well as Dean Daryl Maeda, and we're hopeful that the Department of History will also be able to provide some additional funding as well. So, on behalf of the Center of the American West, I also want to express our gratitude to the Amachi Alliance and the Sand Creek Massacre Foundation. We also want to let you all know that today's event would not have been possible without co-sponsorships from the Center of Asian Studies, the Department of History, and the College of Arts and Sciences. Today's event and the programming that it kicks off have taken a great deal of behind-the-scenes labor and care. So I want to be sure to let everyone know here, know just how tirelessly the wonderful Center of the American West staff has worked to make this gathering and to make the broader programming a success. So heartfelt thanks to Dr. Tamar McKee, our Manager of Programs and Operations. Also thanks to Dr. Brooke Neely, our Senior Research Associate, as well as to Ryan Lewick, our Academic Programs Coordinator. I feel so lucky to get to work with such a talented, kind, and fun team. And without further ado, I want to briefly introduce Connie Chiang and Tamiko Nimura, the speakers who have generously traveled to Colorado to share their expertise with us today. I've known one of our speakers, Connie Chiang, for a few decades, ever since we were graduate students. She was at UW, I was at University of Wisconsin-Madison. When CAW began planning to tackle the topic of Japanese American wartime incarceration, Connie was at the very top of my list for scholars that I was excited to bring to CU Boulder. The Rusack Professor, am I saying that right? Okay, the Rusack Professor of History and Environmental Studies at Bowdoin College in Brunswick, Maine. Connie is the author of Shaping the Shoreline, Fisheries and Tourism on the Monterey Coast, as well as Nature Behind Barbed Wire, an environmental history of the Japanese American incarceration. She is also the editor of Nature Unfurled, Asian American Environmental Histories. Connie is currently writing a collection of essays that explores Asian Americans' multifaceted historical interactions with the natural world. As CAW director, I love being able to bring in old friends, but it's also a joy to meet new people and make new acquaintances through our work. While I've known Connie Chiang for a long time, I've only just started getting to know our second speaker, Tamiko Nimura. Tamiko is an Asian American creative nonfiction writer and public historian who comes to us from Tacoma, Washington. She writes from an interdisciplinary space at the intersection of her love of literature, her grounding in American ethnic studies, the inherited wisdom that she brings in from teachers and activists, and her love of storytelling through history. As the direct descendant of Japanese American incarcerees, Tamiko has worked to keep this history alive through her writing and speaking for more than a decade. She is the co-author of the graphic novel We Hereby Refuse, Japanese American Resistance to Wartime Incarceration, co-authored with Frank Abe. She has a forthcoming memoir entitled A Place for What We Lose, A Daughter's Return to Tule Lake. In a moment, I'll turn the microphone over to Connie. First, I wanted to let you all know to save your questions for the Q&A portion of the event. I also want to let you know that several of our speakers' books are available for sale after this conversation. All right, so please join me in giving a big Colorado welcome to Tamiko Nimura and Connie Chiang.
Mic on? Can you hear me?
Yep.
Awesome. Okay, perfect. Wonderful. Thank you so much for that really generous introduction, Thomas. I really appreciate it. And Tamiko and I would like to begin by extending our gratitude to the Center of the American West for organizing this event and inviting us here. And we were very grateful to Thomas, as well as Ryan Lueck, Brooke Neely, and especially Tamara McKee, for taking care of so many logistical details and for being so supportive of our vision for this event. We'd also like to thank the Eddie family for their sponsorship. Their support certainly ensures that the Japanese American wartime incarceration will continue to be studied and interrogated, and as civil liberties erode all around us, understanding this history is vital now more than ever. So our presentation today uses the window metaphor to spark curiosity and illuminate different entry points into studying this history. We'll also offer a window into our respective research processes and explain what goes into a published piece of writing. Specifically, we'll each be discussing a source that we found in the archives and that's inspired us to delve deeper into this history and develop new interpretations. So I'm going to offer, just giving a kind of brief roadmap, I'm going to offer a little bit of background and framing before talking about the first window, which is the plant, which I'll explain in a moment, and then I'll turn things over to Tamiko, who will talk about the second window, the plaintiff, and she will also offer some thoughts about the broader stakes of doing this history. So I actually want to start by talking about another window. This is a real window. So this picture was taken in March of 1942. Dorothea Lange snapped this photograph of a storefront on the corner of Franklin and 8th Street in Oakland, California. So roughly present-day Oakland, Chinatown. Now, Lange is probably best known for her Depression-era photographs of farmers and farm workers. She worked for the Farm Security Administration and was able to garner a lot of support for Franklin Delano Roosevelt's New Deal policies. But during World War II, the US government hired Lange once again to essentially create a photographic record of the forced removal and incarceration of Japanese Americans from the Pacific Coast. So in the wake of Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor in Hawaii on December 7th, 1941, all people of Japanese ancestry faced intense scrutiny, as many believed that there were spies and saboteurs within their midst. And these individuals could then threaten the security of the nation. So just to give you one example of this widespread fear and hysteria, this is an editorial cartoon penned by Theodore Giesel, also more famously known as Dr. Seuss. And here you can see very gross caricatures of Japanese people of Japanese ancestry. The title, the Honorable Fifth Column, so that implies that they were sort of clandestine saboteurs within the nation itself, and they're lining up to essentially get a block of dynamite, and there's someone with a telescope saying waiting for the signal from home, being Japan. So this was very much the climate in which the policy for the forced removal emerged. This assumed guilt or assumed possibility that there were spies or saboteurs within the Japanese American population. So with this anti-Japanese sentiment running quite high, Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066 on February 19, 1942. And while the order did not explicitly name Japanese Americans, it authorized the creation of military areas from which people could be removed. And so this order provided the necessary authority to forcibly expel people of Japanese ancestry from the Pacific Coast to one of 10 camps in the Inland West and Arkansas. So this is actually from one of the War Relocation Authority, a book and document that was produced by them. But this, I think, shows the situation pretty clearly. The hash mark area was this where if you were a person of Japanese ancestry within this area, you were subject to forced removal and sent to one of 10 camps represented by the black dots. So 2 in Arkansas, sort of the outliers, the rest mostly in the Inland West, and notably 2 in Arizona that are located on Indian reservation land. So this is the context in which Tatsuro Masuda, owner of the Wanto Company, took a bold stand in this picture that I'm returning to. He actually had the sign installed on December 8th, 1941, the day after Pearl Harbor, clearly anticipating the scorn and hatred that he would soon face. So when Lang took this photograph a few months later, his forced removal was imminent. He proclaimed audaciously, fearlessly, that he was an American, regardless of the upheaval that he would soon face. And so as a side note, Masuda was incarcerated at Gila River in Arizona, and both of his children were born there. He moved around a bit, but he eventually settled in Utah and never returned to Oakland or to California or to his family's former store on Franklin Street. So I've always really loved this photograph and found it to be an inspiring example of Japanese American defiance in the face of this egregious violation of their civil liberties. But it also raised for me a myriad of questions. For Japanese Americans, what did it mean to be American when their government viewed them with suspicion, uprooted them from their homes, and placed them in desolate camps? How and why did they assert their loyalty, if at all, to the United States under these fraught circumstances? And keep in mind that 2/3 of the roughly 110,000 people of Japanese ancestry removed from the Pacific Coast were United States citizens by birth. The remaining 1/3 were barred from naturalized citizenship because at the time naturalization was limited to whites and African Americans, and in fact the ban on people of Asian ancestry to become naturalized American citizens was not lifted until 1952. So the sign in the window then sparked a set of research questions that became a chapter of my book, Nature Behind Barbed Wire, which is a broader study of how the natural environment informed the wartime incarceration of Japanese Americans. So as I continued my research, I wanted to learn more about how interactions with the environment informed Japanese Americans' expressions of loyalty. So I want to pause for just a moment and acknowledge my personal position with regard to this history. So I approach these questions as a Chinese American scholar who has no familial connection to the incarceration experience. While I do have a personal link to a broader history of Asian American immigration and discrimination, I study the incarceration as primarily an academic historian. And so I acknowledge that this means that I have certain blind spots. And specifically, I have learned over the many years I've been doing this history to try to be mindful of the descendants of the incarcerees and center their elders' experiences as much as possible. And I'll explain towards the end of my talk of how that manifested itself in this particular story. So now I want to turn to my window, which is, oh, excuse me, my slides are a little out of kilter. For some reason my slides are very much, okay, that's fine, okay. So I want to turn to my window, the plant, and my archival artifact, which I found at the National Archives in Washington, D.C. So the National Archives in Washington, D.C. is right in downtown. You might be more familiar with the front of the building, which is where you enter if you want to see the Declaration of Independence or the Bill of Rights. But on the back side of the building are the archives. And there is a statue here that says, "What is past is prologue." So kind of an inspiration as you sort of walk into this archive, and then you go upstairs, and this is what the reading room looks like. So this archive houses records from several federal agencies, including the War Relocation Authority, or the WRA, which was the civilian agency that oversaw the Japanese American incarceration. So I spent several weeks in this reading room going through dozens and dozens of boxes of records. And one day I found, wedged in between sheaf after sheaf of paper, I found this. So it's unusual to find objects, like non-paper objects, in these archives. But here I came upon what was basically a piece of rubber. It was about the size of an index card, olive green in color, and it was covered, as you can kind of tell, in a thin layer of dust. And embossed along the edge of this piece of rubber was the inscription, "Manzanar Wayule Cooked Shrub." So I knew that Manzanar was, of course, one of the more famous and well-known camps in California. But what was Wayule? And even though it's spelled with a G, it's pronounced with a W, so Wayule is the pronunciation. So Wayule is a small woody, drought-resistant shrub that resembled sagebrush, native to the southwestern United States and northern Mexico. And scientists believed that rubber could be milled from wayule. And this was important during World War II because the Axis powers had gained control of areas in the Pacific and Southeast Asia that supplied much of the world's rubber supply. And as a result, American officials during the war worried about an impending rubber shortage. So they began to organize scrap rubber drives. So these are posters from the wartime era. They began to organize other methods of rubber conservation. So for instance, on the left-hand side, this was to encourage people to actually make sure that their tires were inflated properly so that they could make their tires last as long as possible because these servicemen had more important places to go. Here on the left, they very clearly delineated, encouraging people to drop off their scrap rubber at designated places, and then that rubber could be repurposed for a variety of wartime needs. So the federal government pursued the propaganda campaign, but they also pursued what they believed to be an agricultural solution to the rubber shortage. And so on February 28th, 1942, Congress authorized and created the Emergency Rubber Project, which was to focus on developing domestic rubber crops, including wayule, to address this impending shortage. And so to my surprise, I learned that Japanese Americans at Manzanar participated in this project, but I was certainly quite puzzled about how this happened and why this happened. So as I dug deeper into the archives, it became clear that wayule would in fact help me to answer my larger research question about how the natural environment helped to inform Japanese American expressions of patriotism and loyalty. And I learned that as Japanese Americans worked on this project, they were able to display their patriotism while implicitly calling attention to the nation's hypocrisy. So the story starts with this man, Robert Emerson, who was a scientist at the California Institute of Technology, Caltech, and he decided to launch his own rubber research project during the war. So importantly, Emerson was a Quaker, he was a pacifist, he was very much opposed to the incarceration. And he recognized the talents of many Japanese American incarcerees, which included chemists, botanists, dozens of nursery owners who had grown lots of different plants in the years prior to the war. And he believed that these men could contribute to the study of wayule. He also recognized that their participation could help them prove their loyalty to the nation that had exiled them. So after securing assistance from the Emergency Rubber Project and also getting permission from the War Relocation Authority to allow this research to take place at Manzanar, Emerson had to find Japanese Americans and actually convince them to participate in this project. And this was not an easy sell to all the potential workers. Homer Kimura, for instance, was reluctant to become involved because rubber was a military material, and he didn't want to participate to producing something that would potentially prolong the war. So two other Japanese American scientists eventually convinced Kimura to join the project. And as Emerson noted in a letter, quote, "They explained to Mr. Kimura that my principal purpose in developing the wayule project was to help some Japanese American families to reestablish themselves in American society and to contribute something toward the rebuilding of goodwill in Americans toward other Americans of Japanese ancestry." So wayule work began in earnest at Manzanar in April of 1942 when Emerson hauled 4 gunny sacks full of wayule cuttings to the camp. So tending to thousands of wayule cuttings in the extreme climate of the Owens Valley was incredibly challenging. Nonetheless, by June of 1942, they had planted some 169,000 wayule plants grown from cuttings, and the first yellow flowers began to bloom on the plants in the lath house. So there was indeed a separate facility that was constructed. This is the wayule lath house. It's basically a structure that had slats on the roof so the sunlight could filter in. You can see that here, and you can see all the Waiule beds and all of these little cuttings and little shrubs that were growing. And by the end, and so here are Japanese Americans tending to these seedlings. And by the end of June, they were transplanting those seedlings to different plots of land, four different plots. So they had plots with different types of soil, different types of drainage, different types of location. They were trying to, again, try to experiment, figure out how they could grow Waiule that had the highest amount of rubber content, as well as trying to figure out techniques for extracting the rubber from the plant itself. So all told, there were 3 chemists, 1 statistician, 2 plant propagators, and 16 nurserymen who were working on this project. So outside observers began to provide commentary. I think I have one more slide. Oh, no, here's another slide. Outside observers soon were providing commentary about this project. So Grace Nichols, who was a journalist who was also a Quaker, so very much opposed to incarceration, lauded Japanese Americans as ideal participants in the Waiule experiments. In an unpublished manuscript, she asserted that, and she was referring to the Japanese Americans, that they welcomed it as an opportunity to demonstrate in humble ways that a man's loyalty and patriotism, his love and devotion to his country and its ideals and principles are elements which can never be measured by the narrow bounds of race or lineage or ancestral origin. She noted that they had been deprived of their homes and businesses, and yet their first thought is still to be of service to the country, which has denied them the rights of free men. So for Nichols, the Waiule Project very much highlighted both Japanese American loyalty, but she was clearly also pointing out the nation's hypocrisy. Because here you have these men who are working on a project to aid the war effort, and yet they are being incarcerated in a camp and in violation of their civil liberties. So the Manzanar Waiule team also captured national attention. In September of 1942, Neil Naden wrote this article for the Washington Post. And in the article, and I don't have it all excerpted here, he really focuses on 2 men in particular, Walter Watanabe and Shinpei Nishimura, and he praised their efforts to cross-pollinate different strains of Waiule to increase the rubber content. He also suggested that these men had extra incentive to work hard and prove their loyalty to the country. And ultimately, Naden concluded by also praising the government for giving the Japanese Americans an experimental task which will keep them active and curious. So unlike Nichols, Naden, there was no sort of critique embedded within Naden's article. And so just to give you a sense of the 2 men that he focused on in his article, Walter Watanabe is pictured on the left-hand picture, and Shinpei Nishimura is on the far right of this particular image on the right. So in addition to the Washington Post, Manzanar had its own newspaper that also began to report on the Waiule project. And in some cases very much reinforced what Neil Naden was saying in his article. So one journalist on the left, this is unattributed, so I don't have an author for the one on the left. This author noted, and I'm quoting on the red rectangle, if the experiment at Manzanar proves successful, it would mean that the Japanese will have contributed a substantial share toward national defense, and Japanese residents are happy to receive their opportunity to give further proof of their loyalty. Emerson also contributed an article to the Manzanar Free Press on the right, and he noted that the Waiule team contributed toward the building of goodwill between the Japanese in America and their Caucasian friends and fellow citizens. So the Waiule project in the sort of rhetoric of the Manzanar Free Press thus promoted loyalty as well as interracial cooperation. So very important to note that all of the newspapers in the camps, though very much run by Japanese Americans, were also being censored by War Relocation Authority officials. So I take some of this rhetoric with a grain of salt, recognizing that Japanese American journalists had to sort of pander a bit to the War Relocation Authority and again present themselves as these loyal American citizens. So there could be a lot of sort of subversive rhetoric in these publications. So, but the Manzanar project, I want to emphasize, was not just sort of a front for this sort of patriotic rhetoric, because Japanese Americans did conduct a number of experiments that actually began to yield incredibly important data. So according to Emerson, researchers made over 90,000 wayule cuttings between August and November of 1942 and conducted experiments on propagation and rubber extraction. And all of these experiments began to yield tangible results. Here, Emerson is on the left. Roy Nash was one of the first project directors of Manzanar. So he was the one seated in the center. So Japanese Americans succeeded in getting these cuttings to grow by applying a specific sort of plant rooting hormone. They developed hybrids that could survive in the harsh Owens Valley environment. And they came up with a potentially revolutionary method of milling wayule to produce a low fiber rubber extract. And I indeed, as I showed you, saw evidence of that, like that little square of rubber that I found in the archives. So Ralph Merritt, and here is a field which you could now see that the wayule plants are, this was taken a year later, full-grown wayule plants, no longer little shrubs or little sticks, but now full-grown wayule plants. So Ralph Merritt became the next project director of Manzanar, and he very much affirmed the contributions of the Japanese Americans at Manzanar when he wrote to the WRA director, Dylan Meyer, in August of 1943. And according to Merritt, Japanese American horticulturalists, chemists, and engineers had confirmed that heavy-duty rubber could indeed be produced from wayule, and they had developed the proper methods for rubber extraction. And he noted, quote, "Their leaders are highly skilled and educated in our schools and universities, and we're the most creative type." And quoting from the Bible, he concluded, "The stone that the builders rejected has become the head of the corner." So put another way, Japanese Americans may have been exiled, but they were making essential contributions to the war effort. Now, toward the end of the war, Merritt wrote another essay, once again extolling the patriotism of Manzanar's wayule researchers. He began by noting that scientific research had flourished in an unexpected place, quote, "behind barbed wire fences in a soldier-guarded wartime barrack settlement located on the desert in the shadow of the highest mountain." He concluded that the highest tribute goes to the large group of loyal men of Japanese ancestry who, after an evacuation that took them from their homes and former fields of productive activity, worked without hope of reward or regard to long hours under many hardships and despite an antagonistic public press so that they might make their wartime contribution to the economic upbuilding of America. So Merritt suggested in no uncertain terms that Japanese Americans had transcended their unfavorable circumstances to aid the war effort. But it is important to note that Merritt, while sympathetic seemingly to the plight of Japanese Americans, did not oppose incarceration. And in fact, he had a very paternalistic attitude toward the incarcerees, did not believe that the incarceration actually undermined the principles of democracy, and on the contrary, he thought that the incarceration actually provided numerous outlets, including the Wayule Project, for Japanese Americans to express their patriotism and loyalty to the United States. So the betrayal of democratic ideals was simply not part of Merritt's understanding of incarceration, and he chose to emphasize how the camps facilitated the creation of devoted Americans. Now, I've spoken largely about Merritt and Emerson, and how they framed the Wayule Project to either reinforce, in the case of Merritt, the incarceration, or challenge the incarceration, in the case of Emerson. But what about the Japanese American participants? So I really didn't want to tell this story solely from the perspective of these two white men. And so this goes back to what I said earlier about my position and my desire to center the experience of Japanese Americans. But unfortunately, my sources did not reveal very much about the Japanese American perspective. So I reached out to Glenn Kageyama, whose father, Frank Akira Kageyama, worked on the Wayule Project. And he was very gracious when I emailed him literally out of the blue. And he affirmed a lot of what I had read in the sources. He affirmed that Emerson indeed believed, according to his conversations with his father, Emerson did indeed believe that the project would help Japanese Americans prove their loyalty. However, he stressed to me that in his estimation, that proving loyalty was not the goal of Japanese Americans. because they were already loyal to the United States. And so he explained to me, and I'm quoting from the email he wrote to me, they made every effort to help out with the war effort in any way they could, not to prove their loyalty, but simply to do the right thing as American citizens. They were doing what other Americans were doing, simply doing their share in the war effort to defend their homeland. Oh, I'm sorry, skipped over that. So we'll go back to this. So this sort of curious artifact from the archives then, of course, as I noted, offers physical evidence of Japanese Americans' work and know-how. It also reveals a very complex story about loyalty and what it meant to be an American during these fraught times. As Japanese Americans tended Wayule seedlings, conducted experiments, and made critical scientific discoveries, Emerson hoped to undermine anti-Japanese sentiment. But for Japanese Americans, growing Wayule was a way to highlight their American identity and contribute to the war effort as their fellow Americans did. Again, they had nothing to prove. Now, expressing one's American identity also meant more overt resistance and the harnessing of legal rights to challenge the injustice of incarceration. So I want to turn things over now to Tamiko to explore this second window into the incarceration and the plaintiff.
Technically transfer. How's that? Can you hear me good? Okay, great, thank you. Okay. All right, the plaintiff and the plaintiff part 2. Thank you so much to everybody for coming tonight and for really inviting us to be here. Thank you to all the Center for the American West staff. It's been such a pleasure to be here. All right, so I'm going to talk to you a little bit about a part of a graphic novel that I co-authored, and I always start here with these 2 images. The top one there is baby me with my little sisters, HEREBY, our dad, Tamiko Nimura, and our mom, Helen Nimura, who is Filipina and characteristically hiding behind her fan there. We lost my dad when he was 10, or when I was 10 rather, and that particular loss is something that basically has had me chasing a conversation with Japanese American history and particularly with the incarceration. The image at the bottom there is, I think, one of the only images that I know of that has my grandparents, Junichi and Shizuko Nimura, at the bottom seated there, and all 6 of their children. There's an uncle in the front left who married into the family, and a toddler in arms who's my cousin. But with the exception of those 2, the toddler and then my uncle in the front, everybody else in that picture was incarcerated during World War II. It's an image that I think about particularly for a number of reasons, that it really has stuck with me as that reminder, right, that this is a very deep part of my history, and that there are silences around that history and in my own personal life that have really not let me go. So that's where I start. Okay, so I'm going to talk to you today mostly about a graphic novel that I co-authored called We Hereby Refuse, Japanese American Resistance to Wartime Incarceration. So part of the cover is at the top there, and the creative team at the bottom is me and illustrator Matt Sasaki, my co-author Frank Abe, and Ross Ishikawa. So those 2. It was a 4-person group project. It took us about 4 years. We had the pandemic and lockdown. But something to think about when you look at this book is that we were hired in February 2017. So you think about what that was then, when it just happened in the nation, and the presidential election, the Women's March. So resistance was a big part of the environment when we started writing this book. So it really, in some ways, fueled us and saddened us that this was what we were working with for the book. The book covers really the stories of 3 main people, all real-life characters, real-life people. On the left there is Hajime Jinakutsu. He is known as the sort of inspiration for the main character in John Okada's novel, No No Boy, and he resisted the draft from Minidoka. The middle figure there is Hiroshi Kashiwagi, who really refused and resisted in 2 ways. He refused to answer to this suspicious, quote, loyalty questionnaire that the government issued, and eventually he, in a fit of anger and protest, renounced his United States citizenship. And he's also my uncle. The figure I'm going to talk to you about today, though, is on the right there, Mitsuye Endo. And she was a typist for the state of California, and she refused the government's offer of plea deal to leave camp before there was an actual authorization to return. So let me talk to you a little bit more about Endo. Can you hear me okay with this? It's a little... Okay, so I'm going to take you through the research that we conducted on Endo all the way to the scene in the graphic novel. So you can see how we went kind of from sort of what we knew, and which was very little, all the way up to putting her into the graphic novel and to create a scene. There was very little information about her that we knew of when we started. She had given 2 interviews in her life. They were very short. She was very modest and very private and very shy. There was some rumor that she had had a bad experience with a reporter when she left camp, and so after that really refused to really give much testimony. She also did not return to the scene, the national scene, when the redress campaign happened. And her case, because it was successful, was not part of the more famous coram nobis cases of Hirabayashi and Yasui and Karamatsu. So she really was not very well known on the scene. But her case, out of the 4 cases that went to the Supreme Court during the incarceration, her case was unanimously successful. And because of that, her case actually led to the closing of the camps. And yet we really knew very little about her. So we had to do some digging. Certainly, Frank, my co-author, flew out to Cleveland, I believe, to Ohio to meet her son and daughter and had some conversations with them about their mother. But I also was able to do a little bit of archival research that really got me super excited. So I started actually backwards. I read the secondary source, the Densho Encyclopedia. And Densho, as people have said, is this fantastic resource, free, and has a bunch of articles. The encyclopedia is only part of what they offer. They have oral histories, they have documents that are stand-in. So I thought I would just start to see what we would turn up about Endo. And so I looked up, and in the bibliography for Brian Mia's article about her, I found a case about the NISE employees versus the California State Personnel Board. And when I requested that from the library, it turns out that it was partly an account of the group lawsuit that Endo and other state employees were a part of before they were incarcerated. They took it up before they were incarcerated. So I got the article, and then, oh, that's a fun fact. And then I got this academic journal article, and it is in there. There was a letter from Janet Matsuda, who was Endo's best friend at the time, to James Purcell, who was Endo's attorney. And she basically gave us a sort of secondary-ish source, observer view of endo. And it says, when the exclusion order was lifted on December 17th, I knew we had won our case, and a couple of days later, when Mitsuye Endo, she lives in the next block, came running with a telegram from you, confirmed my belief they had won the case. We were so happy that we actually danced around the room. And I loved this line so much, like 2 pieces, I love this line so much, because it conveyed so much. We don't see very many images of Nisei women being joyful, rightfully so, but to have this particular moment of joy was such a wonderful thing to see and have during this time. So, to go about the research in yet another direction but related, I was able to request the correspondence between Endo and her attorney, James Purcell. Because he was her attorney, he kept every single piece of correspondence that he'd had with his client. And so in requesting her file from Purcell's correspondence, I was able to find this telegram from Endo to Purcell. And it was one of the few places where I was able to hear Endo's voice, right, in sort of real time, right, getting this particular finding, and extremely joyous of results, right? And you could just sort of see and hear that echo of them dancing around the room. That was totally possible given this telegram. And there were other letters that came across in that file. One of them, which I did not reproduce for you here, talked about her deciding, like making the decision to stay in camp while her case proceeded to the Supreme Court. There were others who could have possibly taken her place, but she was the one who was willing, out of the several, she was the one who was willing to go forward with the case, and I found that particularly admirable. So from there, we basically started to work on something called the story arc, which is a sort of summary, right, of our characters' storylines, thinking about what that would look like. Oh, the dance around the room, she telegrams, and then at that same day, Dylan Miner of the WRA announced that they would be closing all of the camps. From there, we had to do something called an impaneled script, which Frank did a lot of work on. An impaneled script, right, is basically a list of suggestions to the artists, right? Maybe this is a full page because it's a big moment in the book. It had to have things like dialogue. It had to have stage directions. It had to have sort of what this might look like in panels. And this was all in sort of conversation with the artists, so a suggestion for the artists. We also had to include a bunch of reference photos for the artists. What did the steps look like? And the post office at Topaz. What was the layout in which Endo would be running, from barrack to barrack to get to that particular place. So the impaneled script then had photos that we looked at. And from there, the artists went to work. This is Rossi Shikawa's work. On the left, you can see his sort of penciled sketch in a bit more cartoonish, right, than I think the right-hand side. The right-hand side then has the sort of full-color illustration from the finished product in the graphic novel. So you can see at the top there, there's the radio looking up, all right, the camps are going to be closed, and then there's Endo coming out of the post office, just so excited to have this happen. And you can see again another version of that on the left-hand side, thinking about what she would be saying, there's Janet, and then on the right-hand side, you can see a facsimile of the telegram that I showed you at the very bottom, and then really, which is one of my top 5 favorite images in the graphic novel. You can see Endo and her friend Janet dancing around the room. So all of that to say is, just those little bits, my hopes in chasing those silences that were in the archives and these silences around Endo herself led to some unexpected discoveries. But I'm so glad that this was a project that I got to be a part of. And I have always loved researching in the archives, actually, but to have those things kind of cross, to hear Endo's voice as she was talking to Priscilla about her conditions, to see the letter where she said, okay, if it's for the good of everybody, I'll stay in camp. If it's for, and I felt that so deeply because that really resonated with what I thought of as what my Nisei aunties would do, right? Like, okay, well, it's not for me, but it's for the good of everybody, so I'll do it. And that resolute nature really hit home for me. And in that same letter, she was clearly quite terrified, I think, at the idea of returning to California without a significant population of Japanese Americans to go with her. And she actually asked in that letter, if I go back to California, can I bring people with me? Can I bring some people with me? And that was just so poignant to me because it really complicates the idea of resistance and refusal as this sort of immediate, defiant protest, fist in the air kind of idea that we have of resistance. And for me, one of the most compelling parts of Endo's story is that she was clearly so terrified and scared, yet she did anyway. And I thought that we needed that. I felt very strongly that we needed that portrait of resistance and refusal in a book about resistance. I wanted sort of paths for people, not just the people who were like immediately defiant. I wanted the path for the people who were scared at first, right, but did something anyway. So there are some things that I wanted to just add for people in thinking about researching and creating, particularly the Seo Hirabayashi Fellows. And some of them are things that Connie has touched on already. But these are things that I think I've sort of gotten from osmosis in my work in American ethnic studies and in Japanese American history. They are lessons that I'm still learning, but I thought that I would add them for you just as some things to think about. As Connie mentioned, it's useful to think about the community of Japanese American descendants in mind, so that if you're doing work on this population, right, to remember that they were real people, that they still have families, right, who might be interested and invested in your telling of this story. I want to encourage folks to think about serving people, serving a community, rather than helping the people. It sounds like a kind of a fine distinction, but really it's about how maybe your work could be of assistance in some way, right, to flesh out this history for people. Certainly seeking out, as Connie did, seeking out Japanese American subjects, viewpoints, community-founded and funded projects like Densho, the resources and archives. It's interesting that really there's so much out there, so much material, often written by Japanese Americans about the incarceration, and yet so little of it seems to be in popular consciousness. So I want to sort of encourage people to seek out that possible blind spot that Japanese Americans have been telling the story for decades, not long after the war and during the war, and so certainly to remember that as you do your research. Connie also talked about a bit of self-inquiry, the possible blind spots with who and what you are, with positionality. And finally, I wanted to encourage people to complete the circle, to share your research results with its subjects or the descendants of the descendant Japanese American community. Here in Colorado, if you work on the Amachi project, certainly then the Amachi Alliance folks would be good to share it with. You can share it with presentations or talks or newspaper articles. There are lots of ways to share your research back, to give it back. next to last thing I wanted to talk about is just that, there are particular stakes for telling the story of Japanese American incarceration right now in 2025. People might have heard about the national park signs that are encouraging people to report anything that they find disparaging about individuals in the past. And there are also community projects that are trying to archive what the signage interpretation that's there now in case it gets taken down. At least one national park sign out on the East Coast referencing both slavery and Japanese American incarceration has been removed. And it wouldn't surprise me if, the administration is coming for other signs as well. So really, in doing this work, you are joining us in our particular struggle to tell this story. And we need all the support that we can get. So I thank you for joining us with your interest and your work on this topic. Really, they are erasing this history, as I picked up this phrase from activist Y.K. Hong. They're erasing it in order to repeat it. So tragically and devastatingly, they're reusing an Army base in Texas at Fort Bliss, which is, I believe, going to be the largest ICE detention center. Federal agents actually came and conducted a raid at Little Tokyo in front of the Japanese American National Museum, where folks were taken in the first place back in the 1940s. They have re-invoked the Alien Enemies Act of 1798, and they're reusing sites where Japanese Americans were incarcerated for immigrant detention. Now, there is a broader coalition, I want to say, for resistance to all of this work. And Japanese Americans certainly have not been silent. They have done so many kinds of protests and resistance and awareness. I believe there's an action this weekend in Dublin, California, where they're trying to do another detention center. So it's not that we are powerless and helpless and hopeless, but we do need, I think, all the help that we can get. Lastly, I just wanted to very briefly mention that I have a memoir forthcoming in April of 2026 called "The Place for What We Lose: A Daughter's Return to Tule Lake." And it incorporates parts of my father's unpublished memoir from when he was at Tule Lake. He wrote it in probably the 1960s, but it covered the time from when he was 10 to about when he was 14. And so my book responds to, disagrees with, fleshes out, corroborates, researches parts of his book as well. And it concludes in part with a community pilgrimage to Tule Lake, where I went and was transformed. So I thank you for joining us in our efforts to really think about the Japanese American incarceration and its parallels to today. And now Connie's going to come back up and we'll have a little bit of conversation. So both of us have questions for each other, but we really hope to have questions and conversation with you all. So we're just going to kick it off, basically. So think about some questions that you might want to ask either of us or both of us.
Yeah, can I go first?
Yeah, please.
So I really loved what you said about endo being this more, not what you typically think of as a resistor, right? I know this is probably an unfair question, but you talked about how this volume sort of emerged in a moment after the first Trump election. I'm wondering if there were volume 2, who would be maybe other individuals.
Other resistors?
Yeah, yeah.
Um,
About
And we tried to cover we tried to cover as much as we could resistance-wise in the graphic novel. I really hope that people dig into the story of the Mother Society of Mininoka and the other mothers societies at other camps who resisted. I didn't know about them really until I got to work on this book. But scholar Mira Shimabukuro has a really wonderful book called Relocating. Is it Relocating Authority? Sorry, Mira. Yes. Who talks about the Mother Society and their petitions to the president and Eleanor Roosevelt. And then there were, in doing work on the Mother Society, I also was able to learn that there were other mothers groups at other camps. So it would be really fantastic to learn more about those. Really, it took us so long to narrow down who we were going to feature in the graphic novel. And there were so many that we could have covered. Some people were like, why didn't you cover, Yasui and, Hirabayashi and Korematsu? And part of our thinking was that there was a lot of material out about them already. And including Hirabayashi's own book, right, documentaries and so on. And so we thought maybe, this would be an okay time to kind of shift the focus a little bit, right, and broaden focus to other kinds of resistance and other resistors. The graphic novel, by the way, is actually one of a series that the Wingwood published. So the first one was about Japanese American veterans. Ours is about the resistors, and the third one is about allies to the Japanese American community during World War II. Okay, so let's see, my question was, let's see. Okay, what was one thing that you weren't able to include in the book that you really wanted to? And why not?
Yeah, I mean, that's actually a really fairly easy one for me to answer. One thing that I wanted to include that I didn't, is health. There are lots of health problems caused by the environment in the camps. And this actually comes out in the piece I wrote about redress, that many people acquired respiratory problems in the camps because they were so dusty. So that's something that I think, and there actually was just an article published in the Pacific Historical Review by Jonathan Van Harmelen about health in the camps. So I'm gratified to see that other people are sort of picking up that mantle. But yeah, that is definitely the one topic that I wish. The health problems that were kind of connected to the environmental conditions. I mean, there are a whole list of health problems that emerged, but specifically the ones that were connected to the physical landscape of the various different camps. So yeah.
All right.
Your questions.
So first of all, thank you both. Your talks were so nicely complimentary of one another, and I learned new things. Like I had no idea that the U.S. government was trying to make rubber out of shrubs during World War II. And Connie, I was really struck by the language that various people were using to talk about, that various non-Japanese Americans were using to talk about Japanese Americans, right? Particularly the word loyalty coming up again and again. And so it reminded me, and I actually just looked up the article by William Peterson. So William Peterson was a sociologist, and in 1966, he wrote an article that most people in Asian American studies think of as the precursor to the model minority myth. And so in this article, he praises, the whole article is about Japanese Americans, and he praises Japanese Americans, and he talks about their loyalty. And so I'm wondering if you can comment on that kind of language of model minorityness. And Tamiko, if also in the work that you and Frank are doing, whether that played a role in how you wanted to portray or not portray, if you understand what I'm saying.
Loyalty.
Yeah. And the kind of model minority rhetoric that I think goes along with loyalty, for better or for worse.
Yeah, that's a great question. And actually there's a wonderful piece, I want to say it's Saturday Evening Post, but I can find it for you. It's called California's Amazing Japanese. That was the name of the title of the article. It was published not too long before the Peterson piece. maybe 1950, I want to say, maybe even slightly earlier, but it's definitely post-war. And it is the celebratory article about Japanese Americans rebuilding their lives after the war. And so I read that, like, well, Peterson was like, you know, he's behind the ball, right? Like, this piece is the one, this is really the genesis of the model minority. So indeed, I mean, I think that, you know, what's interesting about the Waiule story is that you have on the one hand Merritt, who is using the rhetoric of loyalty to essentially affirm incarceration, that these camps are providing these wonderful opportunities for Japanese Americans to prove their loyalty, versus Emerson, who's saying, well, in fact, they're proving loyalty in spite of the fact that they're being detained in these horrific conditions. So I found that really, really fascinating. And then, just as I noted, the email that Glenn Kageyama sent to me, like, was so moving to me. He's like, they didn't need to prove their loyalty because they were Americans, right? So, yeah, I mean, that rhetoric I found really fascinating as well. That in fact, I feel like there's this even earlier article from Peterson that tries to promote Japanese Americans as this model minority, that, you know, after the war, they're no longer our enemies. They are, you know, these bona fide Americans who've gone on to rebuild their lives quite successfully.
I have two things. The first part is about the whole loyalty question and what we had in the graphic novel. And yeah, absolutely, it was, you know, but I think we were also contending, consciously or not, with the internalized sense of loyalty within the Japanese American community, right? There's some, right, who were just like, yeah, we had to prove loyalty, right, without accepting that was a flawed premise to begin with, yeah? So I think that was definitely in the back of our minds, like, yes, loyalty, but loyalty to who and why, and who is defining loyalty in this way, right? So I think we thought about those things, certainly. And then I think it was our graphic designer, actually, who asked us to reproduce real documents, right? So I believe that the loyalty questionnaire facsimile is in there to show, like, you know, yeah, this was an actual thing. I've even talked to other Japanese American descendants who are like, well, yeah, the loyalty questionnaire, right? I was like, but it was called the application for leave clearance. And people were like, what? Right? So even within that, you know, within the community, I think there's, you know, lots of things to kind of unpack for people. So that's the first thing I wanted to say. The second thing I wanted to say is that I actually have a tiny bit of scholarship in my memoir called Reframing Japanese American Bitterness. And that was published in a slightly different form on Discovered EK. But I just did a search for bitterness because I was so tired in some ways of hearing Japanese Americans praised for not being bitter after camp, right? It happened so much. And so I looked up thank you, Densho, yet again. I just did a search, right, for bitter and bitterness. And what came up was so fascinating to me. There were, you know, a number of folks who talked about, you know, being bitter. People who you would expect to be bitter, you know, like Morgan Yamasaki, I think, was a sort of famous no-no boy. He was like, bitter? What? I wasn't bitter. Hisaya Yamamoto actually talked about being bitter. I know, sounds great. But there were two precursors to Peterson's article in Newsweek, good old Newsweek. And one of them, I can't remember the other headline, but the first headline that I can't get over was called Too Grateful to Be Bitter. Too Grateful to Be Bitter. And it was all about these Japanese Americans who were just, you know, so happy to be making their way, and they just, you know, they couldn't think about bitterness. But two Newsweek articles, again, before Peterson's big article, we're talking about this, you know, this bitterness thing. And these articles, I believe, got republished in the Pacific Citizen. And so what I believe was what was happening was that the Pacific Citizen and the Japanese American Citizens League, right, were building some impetus for that legislation that restored that gave the Issei the right to apply for naturalized citizenship. They were building this loyalty narrative, right, in some ways. as a counterpart to anything that would, come across as being enemies or bitter or whatever. So, yeah, there's just so much discourse, right, that people have to, I think, push back against when we're talking about loyalty and its sort of unspoken counterpart, bitterness.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So yesterday was Indigenous People Day, right? And we had Lily Gladstone on campus.
Yes, I saw that.
And so, I'm sort of reflecting on reflections, in your talks to what she said yesterday. And, one of the things that I noted was sort of this for the good of the community thing, right? That is, and I don't know quite what to, I just wanted to comment on that like you both sort of really focused on this sense of a responsibility to the broader community that I think is so often missing from public, our presentation of ourselves in public in kind of modern society. But the thing that I wanted to ask you about is you talked about reporting back to the community, closing the circle and sort of taking your research back. And what Lily talked about was asking permission from the community to share information or, and I think there are lots of different reasons why you might ask permission, right? But I wonder if you being a member, not a member of that community and you being a member of that community, sort of just if you could share or say more about gaining permission in the first place and giving the information back to the community, and then maybe as a side thing or stop there. But the other thing is I know there are Japanese Americans who were not incarcerated, and there's like a big I understand sort of there can be a rift in the community between people who come from incarceration and people who don't. And I just wonder, are there stories there that are not being told that should be told too? Sorry, any of those would be fine.
I'll start backwards maybe, I'm sure. So I know there's a documentary at the very least about the folks who, quote, self-evacuated. Yeah. And yeah, so there's that. There are some accounts, I believe, in Densho about that as well. That's the first part. The second part that I can remember from your question is about gaining consent. So with the graphic novel, I can say that 2 out of our 3 sort of main people, right, were not alive anymore. So that's why we went to the descendants, right? Frank knew my uncle Hiroshi, and he knew Jimakutsu. Neither of us knew Endo, but Frank flew out to Ohio, right, to meet Endo's kids. And I think really, for some folks, there's a reluctance, right, to have the story shared, whether it's because of a privacy issue, whether if it's, the framing that they might be concerned with, right? This was a book about resistors, and some folks might feel really concerned, right, with framing this, who are still sort of in that loyalty resistance kind of binary. Yeah. So we did have to, go through and get consent from different relatives and so on. And there are descendants of maybe some people in that we also feature in the graphic novel who might not have been as thrilled, but we tried to get permission where we thought it was really crucial. So those are the 2 questions that I can remember, and the first one might be,
It was more of a comment, really, just about for the good of the community, sort of being a through line between yesterday's talk and today.
I guess that's something that I've been trying to think about hard, right, as I have been doing this kind of work. Part of my work as a public historian has been around Tacoma's historic Japantown. Tacoma's south of Seattle. while Seattle's Japantown is really pretty well known, Tacoma's is not. So I really tried to chase that, and there are a few descendants around, a few descendants who I was able to talk to, but some of the most meaningful interactions that I've had have been with folks who did not return to Tacoma and whose descendants are seeking information about their family history. My grandmother owned a hotel or operated a barber shop or whatever, and I'm trying to find out more about that location. Can you tell me more? So that's been really moving.
Yeah, the only thing that I'll add about for the good of the community is that I think maybe shortly before the book came out, I started teaching a seminar at Bowdoin on Japanese American Incarceration, and Bowdoin is in Maine. I mean, it has a national student body, but a lot of, I think, more students from the West might be more familiar with incarceration than on the East Coast. And it's been really gratifying to teach that class for the good of a larger kind of college community. Just to see some students, like I've had a student, one thing we talk about is there's a memorial in Washington, D.C. I have a student who happened to be there and snapped a bunch of pictures and sent them, like just little things like that. They read something and it resonated. So I feel like, I'm not, a public-facing or, a quote-unquote public historian, but I do have a captive audience in my students. And I feel like that's sort of the good of the community that I'm trying to perpetuate. And it is by far my favorite class that I teach now.
And then we have some on the chat online too.
Okay.
But I know you've had your hand up.
So were there any other forms of louder resistance to incarceration? Because to me it seems as if incarceration just kind of went as planned and then it just ended as soon as they weren't needed. So were there any other louder forms of resistance?
Yeah, there were a lot. And part of the work that was so interesting and painfully meaningful to me was just how those incidents, narratives had been so varied, right? Both by the authorities, the archives, and the community itself. So there were work stoppages at Manzanar. There was something called the Manzanar Uprising, the Manzanar Riot. There were places where I could too relate where my family was. The military had called a sort of all-camp assembly, right, to address the inmates. Nobody showed up. So maybe not loud, right, but certainly large, right, in that sense. There were hunger strikes. I'm trying to think of the other things that I'm missing, but petitions and so on. But yeah, there were larger protests than I think we've been led to believe.
Some of them are a bit more mundane. Like I talk about in my book, there were basically maintenance workers that went on strike because they were protesting their work conditions, right? They were, I won't go into the particularities of the incident, but so they weren't necessarily, many incarcerators were not complying with orders, and they used their labor as a way to contest the conditions of their confinement.
We have a question online. The first one is, I'm a researcher looking to use food and illustrations to highlight elements of the Amache experience. What roadblocks, surprises, and lessons did you learn from writing, illustrating your graphic novel?
This could take a whole other, what challenges and roadblocks?
Surprises, lessons did you learn from your graphic novel?
So many. So many. And I talked about Endo, for example. She was such a surprise to me in her struggles. Really, what the biggest thing that I took away from writing the graphic novel was that there was so much that I didn't know, and I thought I knew. I thought I knew a lot, and that I'm a descendant of this history. I've been reading about it. I taught it before, and there's so much to uncover. But also, there's a lot of documentation and a lot of resources that probably, you know, much of it's still untapped. You know, the National Archives is a place that I would go to. Densho is another place that I would go to, particularly because Densho is so beautifully indexed. You know, that I was able to really pull a whole piece out of just searching up bitterness was a really amazing thing. I would also look to things like the Densho podcast by Hana Maruyama and Noe Maruyama called Kampu, in which they take advantage of Densho's sort of indexing, and they do a lot of work across the camps. I believe there's an episode on food. Am I misremembering?
No,
Yeah.
no, there is.
No, yeah, so there's an episode all on food, so that would be a great resource.
Maybe one last question?
Tamiko, I'm wondering, you left us on a cliffhanger with the pilgrimage to Tule Lake.
Yeah.
What about it was so transformative for you?
Oh my gosh. So, you know, I think I had just left academia when I went on pilgrimage, and I had kind of thought in this very academic, detached, clinical way that I'm just gonna go and observe. Like, I should just go see what it was like. Tule Lake, you know, sure, I mean, my family was there, okay, I should, you know, go and experience it, right? And the kind of collective mourning, collective grief, collective healing that I found there and experienced there was so incredible that I had to write a book about it. Honestly, you know, I came back from that. I was practically speechless when I came back. People were like, "How was your trip to Tule Lake?" And I was just like, like this, like I just could not speak. I tried to write about it, and I could barely write about it. It was so powerfully moving. And I was there with 4 of my family members, right? 2 of them were survivors. My uncle Hiroshi was one. My uncle Sadako, who was my dad's younger sister, was also there, and 2 of my cousins. And I think I tried not to feel anything for the first couple days that I was at Tule Lake. I was just sort of, you know, okay, I'm here. Here's the sagebrush. Here's, you know, these barbed wire fences. Here's Castle Rock and all of that. And it was on the very last day of the pilgrimage when basically somebody told me to talk about racism that I just burst into like the ugliest cry I'd ever had in my whole life. Just the import of and the impact of feeling all of that in that space and trying not to feel it for so long, and feeling also the loss of my dad while I was there. That was basically that's the story of this next book. The subtitle should be something like How Tamiko Learned How to Cry.
Okay, well, so Connie and Tamiko are going to be available for a little bit afterwards. As I said at the beginning, we've got books for sale in the back. I'm sure they'd be happy to sign those. You know, if there are questions you're wanting to ask that you didn't have a chance to ask, please come up. And thank all of, I want to give all of you a big thanks for being here, and I want to thank our guests for a really wonderful, really informative, really wide-ranging